The scoreboard is the kindest part of this match for LAFC because the performance data tells a much more violent story of incompetence. If you only look at the 4-0 result, you're missing the most damning parts of the data. This was a total systemic failure that exposed the ceiling of LAFC's current roster. Between the thin bench and the thin air, the team was mentally and physically incinerated. The second half didn't just see them concede goals, it saw them lose their shape, their discipline, and their identity. It was a 5-2 aggregate blowout that felt like a mercy killing by the time the final whistle blew. To understand this collapse, we have to look at the oxygen gap. In the first half, LAFC maintained a defensive compactness that limited Toluca to low-value shots from distance. They were playing a high-stakes game of keep away, but they weren't keeping the ball, they were keeping their shape. Statistically, when a team has less than 35% possession at altitude, they are essentially sprinting while holding their breath. By the 45th minute, the tracking data showed a 12% increase in the distance between LAFC's midfield and defensive lines. The cracks were there, Toluca just needed a spark to ignite them. That spark arrived in the 49th minute with the Paulinho penalty. From an analytical perspective, this goal was the structural end of the match. For LAFC, the 1-0 aggregate lead was their only shield. Once Paulinho converted, that shield shattered, and the team was forced to transition from a low block to a mid-press, a transition they were physically incapable of making. The decision-making process in the box leading to that penalty was a direct result of hypoxic fatigue. When your brain is starved of oxygen, your footwork becomes heavy and your timing disappears. Paulinho didn't just score a goal, he broke the mental seal of the LAFC defence. From that point on, Toluca's pass completion rate in the final third jumped from 68% to 84%. They weren't just passing around LAFC, they were passing through them. The thin air excuse only goes so far. The thin bench is where the real blame lies. While Toluca looked to the sidelines and saw fresh, high-intensity attackers, LAFC looked back and saw a roster that had already given everything it had in the first leg. By the time Everardo López made it 2-0 in the 58th minute, the game had shifted from a tactical battle to a cardiovascular massacre. Watch the movements of the LAFC wingbacks during this sequence. They are no longer checking their shoulders. They are ball-watching, rooted to the spot. Lopez's goal was a product of spatial exploitation. He didn't have to be faster than the defenders. He just had to be more awake. The aggregate score was now 2-1 in favour of Toluca, and LAFC was officially in the death zone. They needed an away goal to survive, but they had no players left with the legs to carry the ball into the opponent's half. This is where the incompetence becomes undeniable. A team of this calibre should have a plan B for when the altitude takes its toll, but the data shows that LAFC's offensive output in the second half was virtually non-existent. They didn't just stop scoring, they stopped threatening. This offensive paralysis wasn't just a lack of effort, it was a total breakdown in the passing triangles that usually define LAFC's transition play. Between the 65th and 85th minutes, the data shows that LAFC's average pass length increased by 40%, a clear sign of panic. Instead of the controlled, short passing game that got them to the semi-final, they began launching hopeful long balls into a vacuum. Toluca's centre-backs were winning 90% of their aerial duels because they weren't being challenged by a cohesive attack. They were being gifted possession by a team that was too tired to think. We have to look at the recovery time metric here. Whenever LAFC lost the ball, it took them nearly 8 seconds longer to get back into their defensive shape than it did in the first leg. In professional football, an 8-second delay is an eternity. It gave Toluca the freedom to rotate the ball across the entire width of the pitch, stretching LAFC's midfield until the elastic snapped. The structural incompetence was most visible in the half-space vacuums. In a standard 4-4-2 or 4-3-3, the defensive midfielders are responsible for shielding the gap between the fullbacks and the centre-backs. But as the clock ticked past 70 minutes, those midfielders were no longer shielding. They were surviving. They were caught in a dead leg phase where their sprinting recovery had plateaued. This allowed Toluca to execute overload patterns on the wings with zero resistance. Every time Toluca shifted the ball from left to right, LAFC's block shifted 2 seconds too late. This 2-second lag is the difference between a blocked cross and a 4-0 thrashing. As a fan, watching the backline scream for help that never came was the most damning evidence of a roster built for the regular season, not the high-altitude gauntlet of a continental knockout stage. As we look closer at the tactical vacuum, we have to address the zonal abandonment. By the 75th minute, Paulinho and Alexis Vega were essentially playing a different game. They recognised that LAFC's pressing triggers had deactivated. In a functioning system, when an opponent enters Zone 14, a defender must step out to engage. LAFC's defenders, paralysed by the fear of being beaten for pace, stayed glued to their 6-yard box. This gave Toluca free play in the most dangerous area of the pitch. This is where the incompetence label becomes justified. Even if you are physically exhausted, defensive positioning is supposed to be muscle memory. But for LAFC, the muscle memory failed because the tactical instructions from the bench were non-existent. There were no adjustments, no shift to a desperate 5-4-1 to keep the aggregate score close, just a slow, agonising slide into chaos. The game intensity index shows that Toluca actually ramped up their sprinting distance in the final quarter of the match, while LAFC's dropped to a walking pace. This is the violence of the data we're talking about. It wasn't a competitive match in those final 15 minutes. It was a professional team playing against a group of players who were physically broken and mentally defeated. Every time an LAFC player looked at the clock, they saw a mountain they couldn't climb. The lack of leadership on the pitch was staggering. No one was screaming for organisation. No one was demanding a tactical reset. They were simply waiting for the inevitable. This period of passive surrender is what set the stage for the catastrophic ending. You cannot play with that level of passivity in a continental semi-final and expect to survive. You are essentially inviting the opponent to humiliate you. The Ryan Porteous red card in the 88th minute was the final, ugly exclamation point on this night of frustration. It was a cynical failure, a moment where professional discipline was abandoned for a tired, reckless impulse. At 2-0, the tie was still alive, but Porteous's exit signalled Toluca to stop playing safe and start hunting, leading to a stoppage-time massacre where Paulinho strolled through a ghost town defence for 2 more goals. This 5-2 aggregate disaster proves LAFC's current squad is built for domestic comfort, but is woefully unprepared for the harsh, high-altitude realities of continental competition.